For the past several years, I've been buying a ton of shares of ticker symbol VZ Verizon Communications to the point to where, as of right now, across all my dividend paying portfolios, I currently have around 1,262 shares with an average cost of just over $50 per share. Now, in this video, we're going to talk about Verizon stock, analyze its performance, and I'm going to explain why or why not I think Verizon could be offering a good buying opportunity for long-term dividend growth investors like myself. Then stick around because later on in the video, we are going to go over exactly how much Verizon pays me as far as dividend income on a quarterly basis. And just a little hint, it's one of my biggest dividend payers across my entire portfolio. So whether you currently own any shares of Verizon or maybe thought about it, make sure to stick around, drop a like down below, and let's get right into it. I just finished my brand new dividend investing ebook where I share exactly how I went from zero to now over 7 figures invested, and also on how I earned more than $6,000 per month in dividends. I also finished my custom dividend tracker that you can use to track your dividend income progress on an ongoing basis. So make sure to grab yourself a copy of my dividend investing ebook and the new dividend tracker today. It's the first link in my description. So the first thing I want to do is look at Verizon's performance over the last year and of course in the max time frame. Verizon over the last year is actually up 4.26%, and it has recovered pretty decent considering Verizon just a few months back in October of last year was trading in the $30 range. And I'm not going to lie, I was shaking a little bit because of course, as I showed you, I do own a ton of shares of Verizon across my portfolios. Now, just a side note, just to be transparent, I have been selling covered calls on all of my Verizon shares for years now, ever since Verizon was trading in the $50 range. And if you're not really familiar with what selling covered calls are, basically you're hoping that the stock that you're holding either trades sideways or goes down, and along the way you earn a ton of premium by selling these covered calls. So because Verizon has traded basically sideways and down, I've been able to capture thousands and thousands of dollars over the past few years by selling these covered calls, which has definitely made up for the lack of price return that Verizon has seen over the past 5 or so years that I've been holding the shares. Now, I started buying Verizon a while back in 2019, I think, and grabbed a lot more in 2020 because at the time I wanted to find a good dividend growth stock that had a relatively low beta. And although Verizon stock, of course, is a telecommunications stock, which I think we can all agree on isn't the hottest, most sought after sector across the entire market, I figured Verizon was at least much better than that of like AT&T and maybe even T-Mobile, so I loaded up on a ton of shares of Verizon, spending around $70,000 on my overall position. Now, to state more the obvious, Verizon stock is down around 15% on the all-time max time frame. And of course, even though this does not include the massive dividend that Verizon does and has paid along the way, it still has been a stock that hasn't had the performance that a lot of investors like myself would have hoped it to have. But even though Verizon hasn't performed all that well as far as price return goes, over multiple time frames and definitely over the time frame that I've held and owned Verizon stock, the dividend has been pretty massive since I started buying Verizon years ago and has been raised several times since I've owned the shares. Now, the dividend Verizon's offering as of currently is around 6.27%. And side note, Verizon was offering a starting yield over 7%, I think just a few months back. So if any investors were able to grab some shares of Verizon and lock in a 7% starting yield, only the future will tell how that unfolds, but that sounds like a decent entry. And even though Verizon is in the telecommunications space, which we've seen massive dividend cuts from things like AT&T, for example, Verizon has paid a very consistent quarterly dividend. And like I mentioned earlier, Verizon has also increased the dividend several times just during the time frame when I've owned the shares. Now, even though Verizon has only raised their dividends, say a penny or two on a yearly basis, because I own well over 1,000 shares, that's a nice size increase across my entire portfolio, which has actually raised my overall dividend income pretty substantially. But speaking of Verizon's dividend, and if or if not Verizon's dividend is even safe, according to simplysafedividends.com, Verizon does have a 70 on the dividend safety score meter, which actually just as of recently was downgraded from an 80, and this was back in July of last year, and this was due to the entire lead cable fiasco, which if you guys didn't hear about this, let me give you a little bit of insight. It says the Wall Street Journal identified over 2,000 lead-clad cables spread across America on poles, in ground, and under waterways. Random testing showed that lead levels in nearby soil and water exceeded the EPA safety guidelines, triggering fears of 3M-like legal liabilities that could drag on for years. Now, of course, when this came out, this dropped Verizon's stock price even more because this sounded like a costly problem. But since then, a lot of analysts were saying that some of the fears might be a little bit overblown, and it's not necessarily going to break Verizon long-term as a company. Now, I also thought it'd be interesting to see Verizon's forecast, and according to 16 different analysts with a 12-month price forecast for Verizon stock averaging around $43.50, with the low end estimate being $36 and a high end estimate being $50 per share. And honestly, in my opinion, from someone that's been holding Verizon shares for years now, that looks like a pretty on point 12-month forecast. And although Verizon did recover pretty nicely over the past few months, now trading above $40 per share, I thought it might even take a little bit longer because, like I showed you guys earlier, Verizon was in the low 30s, which definitely had me sweating there for a second. Now, before I go in and show you my actual dividend income that Verizon pays me on a quarterly basis, which again is probably one of the best things about owning this stock at this point, if I were to circle back and answer the question, is Verizon a good buying opportunity right now for a long-term dividend growth investor? I would say that, at least for me personally, if as of right now I didn't own any shares of Verizon, which of course I do own a ton of shares of Verizon, but if I didn't own a single share of Verizon, and maybe not even a single share of AT&T or any of the other telecommunication companies, in the low 40s where Verizon is trading as of right now, I personally would not necessarily buy any shares, but I would definitely watch to maybe grab a few shares under 40. And again, my sizing would be very, very small because this sector just doesn't really have all that much room to grow. And there's also the reality that Amazon has been talking about creating their own telecommunication line. And I just don't think Verizon or AT&T or really any of the big monster telecommunication companies have that much room to grow from here. So because of that, I personally would not buy any shares of Verizon if I were to have the choice to, as of right now, unless of course Verizon dips substantially. And in that case, I personally would probably grab a few shares for a buy and hold position. But again, in my opinion, if you want to get a 6 or 7% yield, there's better positions out there at this point, in my opinion, like ticker symbol EPD, or even buy something like JPIE or JPIE, if of course you're chasing high yield, but maybe you want some more diversification along with it. Now, lastly, to see how much Verizon is paying me as of right now as far as dividend income, which is, like I said, one of my favorite parts about owning this stock as of this moment. If you take my 1,262 shares of Verizon, which is how many shares I currently have around a 6.6% yield on cost, which is roughly around $374 on a monthly basis, but of course Verizon pays on a quarterly basis. So all in all, Verizon is paying me around $4,400 per year in dividends if you were to tally up all my shares across my entire portfolio. And keep in mind, this is of course just estimated. Now you guys might be asking also, well, it sounds like you're not really that big of a fan of Verizon. Why are you still holding on to Verizon? Why not sell off the shares even at a slight loss and put that money into something that has more growth potential and something that I'm overall just more bullish on? And my answer to that would be you're 100% correct. And that's why I've been selling very close to in the money covered calls on Verizon across my entire portfolio, and I've been earning a ton of premium over the past few months by doing so. And if Verizon, for whatever reason, does trend up significantly, my shares of course are going to be at risk to be sold off, and at that point I'm going to re-divvy the money out into something that has a little bit more growth potential. But all in all, zooming out a little bit, Verizon at some moments did seem like a horrible investment that I made when Verizon especially was trading near the 30s. But all in all, over the time frame that I've held onto Verizon, because it's traded the way that it has sort of been a perfect situation for someone like myself that's been selling covered calls, like I mentioned earlier in the video. Because if you sell nearly in the money covered calls, and if the stock ETF that you're selling the covered calls on trades sideways and slightly down slowly over time, that's sort of the perfect situation when it comes to a perfect stock, or at least price movement when it comes to selling covered calls. So because I've been able to sell covered calls, and because Verizon's been paying me around $1,000 on a monthly basis for quite some time now, all in all, my Verizon position has not really been all that horrible, considering I guess what it could have been if I didn't of course sell covered calls along the way. But when it comes to ticker symbol VZ Verizon Communications, I want to hear from you guys down below. Are you currently holding on to any shares of Verizon in your portfolio as of right now? And if so, are you buying any more shares where it's trading as of currently? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like on it and subscribe for more future content like this. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.